Some examples of Semmelparis species are Pacific salmon, which will all spawn at the same time and then die. So they spawn, they produce a whole bunch of eggs, and then they will die. Another example is the giant Pacific octopus. And these guys are really cool. Any one female can weigh up to about 400 pounds, and they lay a single clutch of eggs, probably around 100,000 eggs. They brood them for about 6 months, and they don't feed during that time. They ventilate them, and then they die shortly after the eggs hatch. They pretty much protect them and exhaust themselves by this kind of parental investment. So both of these are clearly examples of this big bang kind of reproduction, just reproduce once in a lifetime and then usually die pretty shortly after that. Some plants are also Semmelparis, notably the annual plants that follow a pretty simple life cycle. So they hatch from a seed or emerge from a seed, germinate, I guess is the right botanical term, and then they grow up into the adult, which will flower, and then often the seeds are produced during the flowering process. They mature, and then after the flower dies, the seeds are released. So there's pretty much just this one bout of reproduction within an individual's lifetime. Often the century plant is given as an example of a Semmelparis plant, but this plant lives for about 25 years, not really a century, before it undergoes a single bout of reproduction, and it produces this stalk that's about 20 feet tall. And this portion here will drop bunches of seeds and then it dies. So in that sense, it's Semmelparis. So the plant itself is not exactly entirely Semmelparis because it can also reproduce asexually. So it's produced these genetically identical clonal offspring over here. So that makes it technically not entirely Semmelparis, but the fact that it flowers, produces seeds once and dies is kind of the Semmelparis portion of the plant. So these unique plant and animal examples of semmelparity again represent some unusual ways of reproducing. Pretty much everything else that you can think of reproduces iteropariously, meaning having several offspring throughout different parts of the life cycle. And you can see why that strategy has many advantages over Semmelparis reproduction for most species. So different sorts of traits for species, such as when you reproduce, how much you reproduce, how big you are when you reproduce, these kinds of traits can vary among different species. And the way that they vary actually suggests that there are trade-offs. This word trade-off we're going to keep coming back to. And that there are constraints into how much you can reproduce as well. So there's kind of this binary idea of species being either R-selected or K-selected, or R-strategists versus being K-strategists. And we're going to come back a little bit later as to why we're using these letters. This is a little r and a capital K. And again, when we talk about population growth and some equations for population growth, we'll see where those letters come from. But for right now, the so-called R-selected species tend to be small in size. They grow rapidly. They have short lifespans. They produce lots of small seeds relatively quickly. And so they're good at seed dispersal, and they often tend to be early colonizers. Okay. On the other hand, we have species that live a lot longer. Okay. So these are the K-selected species down here, and things like this old oak tree that lives for a long time, produces fewer larger seeds, has relatively poorer seed dispersal, and so they kind of put their energy into being large, growing slower, having a longer lifespan, and fewer offspring that they contribute more resources towards. So these R and K selected species are then kind of on the opposite ends of a spectrum, and there probably are, there definitely are likely these continua in between, but species tend to sort of group themselves off into these more or less these kind of groupings. So again, it's a trade-off. Are you going to put your energy into growing small, maturing really quick so you can start producing offspring right away? Are you going to allocate resources to your growth and longer lifespan and put more energy into fewer, higher quality offspring that may have a better chance of survival? This is kind of the evolutionary trade-off. Of course, these organisms aren't sitting in a room making this decision, but evolutionary processes have decided for them which trade-off makes the most sense for that particular species. This table just summarizes some of the kinds of characteristics of R and K selected species that I was mentioning. The growth rate, which is where little r comes from, for R selected species is high. For K selected species is relatively lower. Rapid development versus slow. High reproductive rate versus low. When you reproduce, do you reproduce when you're young or later in life? Okay. For R selected species, it's early. For K selected species, it's late. Small versus large body size. Short versus long life. Competitive ability. Usually R selected species aren't great competitors. They're kind of selected towards just live quickly, reproduce now, and get out of there before you get outcompeted or die from other factors. Whereas K selected species tend to be stronger competitors that can hold their own. We see some other characteristics on this table here that have to do with, again, characteristics that we're going to talk about later, such as survivorship, population size, dispersal ability I mentioned earlier, the kinds of habitats you tend to find them in. Disturbed habitats are really good at these early colonizing species that kind of get in there, reproduce quickly, and then tend to be replaced by other species later. Okay, so and here are some examples. Again, we're going to talk a bit more about all of these features later when we talk about population growth, and also when we talk a little bit about community succession. Just another representation of how we can look at this as a continuum, and that we expect to find species that somehow fall in between along this kind of continuum here. This graph numerically illustrates this sort of, do you live fast and die young, or do you live more slowly and steady and produce offspring more slowly? And this is the trade-off, again, that we see species having to make, and what determines whether you go this way or that way. But this particular graph looks at generation time, so living longer over here versus the intrinsic rate of increase. Again, little r is the growth rate. Okay, so shorter lived species tend to have higher rates of R, right? And as we go along this line here, longer lived species tend to have slower growth rates. And you can see where these different kinds of species align themselves, like bacteria are super quick growers, right? And then you've got some protists in here. And then we start to get larger organisms, even though we're still looking at some invertebrates like flatworms and fruit flies and some other insects like flower beetles, other inverts like tapeworms. And then we start to see more of the vertebrates, like small mammals like rats and voles, certain kinds of fishes, okay? And then we've got sardines, some other insects here that tend to be a little bit more towards the K selection side of things, where their intrinsic rate of increase is low. And then we've got humans at the far end here. Again, illustrating the same concept of this trade-off. And the ecological and evolutionary question becomes, where are you along this line, and why? What are the selective forces that have caused a species to be in this position as opposed to that position, for example? So the concept of allocation becomes really important. Like, how do you allocate your resources? You know, if somebody gave you $100 and said, you only have $100 to spend on food, you know, should you buy a whole bunch of chocolate bars and potato chips, and then you only have, like $2 left for broccoli. How do you allocate it? Do you buy a lot of good vegetables, or should you buy a lot of meat? And anyway, it's a trade-off that you make. If you spend your money on one thing, you don't have it available for another. In the same instance, organisms allocate limited energy or resources to one function at the expense of another. Okay, so if you spend a lot of energy and resources growing really large, right, you're not going to have as much energy for reproduction, and vice versa. One example of a life history trade-off that we see made by mammals, for example, here, is whether to have fewer big, high-quality offspring or to produce many more small, maybe lesser quality offspring, but the hope that at least some of them will make it. Okay, so for example, on this end of the spectrum and along the bottom here, we have relative number of offspring per litter. So these guys on the right here produce relatively more offspring, and these guys on the left produce fewer offspring, this being about some average number here. So this is the sort of few big high quality on the left and the many more perhaps slightly lesser quality. And we see certain kinds of mammals falling out here, like rabbits that produce more offspring, and certain kinds of insectivorous mammals, okay, as well as a few other kinds of carnivorous mammals. And then on the other end of the spectrum here, we see bats that, again, actually provide parental care and produce fewer offspring and really put some energy and time into caring for those offspring. We've got primates on this end of the spectrum as well. This slide shows one consequence of a life history trade-off, which is if you have more offspring, they're going to be smaller, and if you have fewer offspring, they're going to be bigger. So this is basically the size of the offspring in terms of their weight. So the weight of a nestling for this particular species here, this bird called the great tit. And these guys, if they produce a high number in the clutch, the weight of the offspring is going to be relatively smaller. And if they produce fewer offspring in the clutch, the weight of each offspring is going to be larger. And again, this is a trade-off because the heavier ones may have a better chance of survival. On the other hand, if you produce more, maybe at least a few of them will be able to make it. Okay, so again, a life history trade-off. So many species face these kinds of decisions, again, from an evolutionary point of view. They're not sitting around thinking about it, but from an evolutionary point of view, there are decisions about how much yolk should you provision each of your eggs with, or if it's a plant embryo, how much endosperm. That's an allocation of energy. Should you provide or produce egg capsules for protection? That costs energy. Should you spend time caring for your offspring, being a good parent, putting that kind of time and energy and risk into caring for and feeding the offspring, or should you just let them go off on their own so that you can spend your energy producing more offspring? And that has to do with guarding and brooding eggs, hatchlings. So all of these, again, become these differences in parental investment that are evolutionary decision points. For this bird here, the kiwi, we can see that a lot of energy is allocated into the reproduction of a single offspring. This is this huge egg inside the body here in this X-ray photograph. And this egg is so large that it takes up 15 to 20% of the bird's body size. So that's a big allocation of energy towards a single offspring. The same kind of trade-off is seen in plants in terms of how much energy that you put into seed production. Should you produce a lot of really small seeds? And some plants producing up to 1 million lesser quality seeds here, but let them spray out and disperse versus those that produce fewer, maybe only 100 seeds per plant, but they're relatively larger and they're more well nourished. And again, everything along this continuum.